This review contains spoilers, so if you do not wish to be informed about the plot of this movie, you can skip ahead to this part of the video for the review summary. After this tragic and not at all avoidable incident, the surviving CDC man is about to clarify some shit. Apparently they were alerted by a vet taking care of a sick dog when suddenly the dog went nuts, with similar symptoms as those displayed here, as it started attacking other animals, which in turn also became aggressive. That's a wonderful revelation, but a few things don't add up. So the dog attacked the other animals, but he didn't attack any of the humans? Surely if the clinic has animals just walking about, there should also be owners present, and at the very least the vets themselves are human. Why were they not attacked, as is clearly the case here? In this story, the guy says it's something they had never seen before, but the symptoms are literally identified as rabies, or at least rabies-like, which a vet should be able to recognize. It also means that they were probably too late, as this means that there is at least one other outbreak hotspot, but I don't know enough about what's going on at that clinic to judge or complain about it.
Was the dog's name Max?
They identified the dog as Max. Remember from that point where I called that this would happen during Brianna's interview? So speaking of Brianna, everyone turns to her and her mom now. Notice how Brianna looks way more pale than she did before.
Chappy.
Okay, I know she's being protective, but Jesus! You just heard it's confirmed that your dog was sick, and your daughter, that got sick around the same time, who is showing similar, although not equal symptoms, is extremely likely to be contagious as well, and biting the neck has pretty much been the infected's MO. Why do you put her fucking mouth on your neck? Why do you have to make it so easy for them? I mean, by now everyone must be able to tell what's going to happen next. Brianna goes bananas and runs up the stairs after biting her mom. They're at least smart enough to restrain her, but they tie her to the banister directly next to the bottom steps. Okay, who wants to bet she will turn feral and that the survivors will struggle to get past her trying to climb the stairs? 100 to 1 odds. The unnamed immigrant couple is suddenly afraid something will happen to their father upstairs as the little girl was going there.
I thought everyone was down here.
What? You were there when they counted. In fact, you did the head count. You know at least one, presumably two, other people in the building are still upstairs.
And your father's upstairs?
You've literally said this to confirm. Even if you forgot what you said before, it costs you nothing not to say something incredibly stupid right now. But okay, I guess even the most sensible person in this crisis is now starting to lose his credibility. Also, why don't they sedate her? Ugh, why do I bother? So then they go upstairs to drug a 5-year-old, and I check in Miss Espinosa's room only to find out she's no longer where they left her. Do we call time of death on her too soon? It also struck me here that they never checked to see if she was actually dead like they did with unnamed cleaning lady. They then find Brianna in the closet.
I need you to give me your hand, okay?
Have you learned nothing? Do they not value their lives? You've seen what they do. You've seen her attack. Fucking shoot her! Or if you're so desperately set on trying to use that sedative that clearly did not work in Fletcher, why do you not take any precautions to prevent this extremely predictable biting incident? Also, why is Scott just standing idly by while this kid wrecks the policeman? Maybe help? They then mash Miss Espinosa to bits to ensure she stays dead this time while leaving the policeman and the kid.
Go, 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 go! Go!
Once downstairs, they realize all hell is about to break loose as the infected crawl their way under this door. Instead of just mashing them with this weapon, Jake puts said weapon down to kick him instead for maximum efficiency. After failing miserably, everyone runs back upstairs. Angela tries to free Kathy but fails and is dragged away, right before the infected officer feasts on this conveniently placed snack. The leftover survivors all hole up in the same room except for the immigrant couple that decides to hide elsewhere. A quick check reveals that no one was bitten except for Sadie, who says no but is clearly bleeding. The CDC guy is also found and he attests that he has been bitten. Their response to finding out that the CDC guy was bitten is to lock him behind glass doors. The response to finding out that Sadie was bitten is,
"We have to kill him."
Bernard loses it and tries to escape through the window. This is a suicide action as the building is still surrounded and a sniper takes him out. This is the second time that Yuri tells Jake there might be a way out. And we all know what a huge success the last attempt was. They are sent to a drain cover, but it needs a key which is in his room. But I wonder, at about 15 minutes in, they showed they were bringing
Tools. Really anything we might need to break a lock or open a door.
Why would they go out of their way to get a key when clearly they have the means necessary to open doors and locks? I'm also willing to bet they could easily break the walls of the building with that sledgehammer we've seen him use a few scenes ago. Yet it never dawns on them they could have used that to escape before security got as tight as it did. And even after, you could have attempted to break the walls and move to nearby buildings and escape from there. Success not guaranteed, of course, but it's better than a guaranteed death if you stay inside here. So while Yuri is telling this story, the CDC man turns and kills him. Scott, Angela, and Jake escape as Wanda refuses to leave Yuri behind, and she is subsequently being attacked by Sadie, presumably killing her.
The key's in Yuri's apartment!
For those keeping score, this is actually where we first learn Yuri's name, which means they must have told them off camera because otherwise they couldn't have known. They don't know where he lives and decide to check the mailboxes downstairs. On their way down, it is confirmed that Nadif was zombified. After they find the address, they are blocked at the staircase by Kathy, as I called. They then escape in the elevator, presumably running on backup generators, where they kill the dog and find Randy's corpse. Several infected residents are shown throughout the scene, as we also confirm Shwahir got infected, and many of them are killed in various ways on their way, primarily by Jake, who is clearly the hero of the bunch. It makes me sad to realize he's surely going to be the next one to die, as obviously the reporter and the cameraman are going to be the last two standing. Alas, after finding the keys, Jake gets overpowered by an infected Yuri. They need to go downstairs, but since it's crawling with infected, they are forced to go further up, and they enter the apartment in the attic, where a man from Boston lives that hasn't been seen in months. Inside the apartment, they find a buttload of rodents and a bunch of articles implying that some cult stole some bioweapon. I tried to read the articles by freezing them at a clear time, but the only article I managed to read is about Zimbabwe and not about a doomsday cult at all, so they clearly didn't even bother writing the articles for this. They've purposely kept them vague, and you don't notice this when you regularly watch the movie, but it's still sloppy and incredibly lazy.
Please get the light on me, please get the light on me. Okay?
Why? Wouldn't it make more sense to keep the camera on the surroundings? They search through the stuff but clearly don't care to analyze what they find, as they toss most things away without even looking at them, until they find a tape recorder. The message played is unintelligible. In Rec, this is actually where they reveal the plot climax, which is the only noticeable storyline difference between the two movies. They find a trapdoor leading up, where what looks like a large baby breaks the camera lights, after which they switch to night vision, which is a redundant feature for a reporter's camera, which it apparently conveniently has. In night vision, a seemingly infected individual seems to be living there and is doing things completely in the dark. After Scott makes a sound, the dude kills him and starts to eat him, as can be seen when Angela grabs the camera. The movie ends with her being dragged into the shadows, presumably killing her. Rec actually has 3 more sequels, 2 of which feature Angela Vidal as a character, implying she actually did not die. This is where the recording ends and where the camera is found. It's kinda weird that the camera is allowed to be found given the circumstances. I would have expected them to burn the whole building down, as it's covered in contagious bodily fluids. And this, of course, is not even taking into consideration that it is very unlikely that this much would have been filmed. Aside from the fact that they were constantly told to turn the camera off, they never did. But what strikes me as even more odd is the fact that filming all of this apparently became more important than surviving. Towards the end, it became progressively more common for Scott to keep filming even though someone was being attacked, and while they were chased. I don't know how heavy such a camera is, but I'm pretty sure that running without it is much easier. I completely understand that it was imperative for the movie that the camera kept filming, and this is far from the most unrealistic thing about the movie, but the further I got, the more it started to bother me how he just kept rolling while people were bleeding out, being attacked, being murdered, or while he himself was being chased. It actually bothered me a lot more that Angela kept shouting that the recording should continue as if it was something of crucial importance, even when very little had yet transpired. In several instances, she blames others for arguing against filming while people were dying, while neither she nor Scott were helping with the problem by recording it. I figured it might be interesting to compare the two movies. It should be noted that I've spent significantly more time analyzing Quarantine than I did analyzing Rec. Most of the story and the characters are the same, and many scenes in the building are a one-on-one copy of the original. As such, Rec features the same news reporter and a similar cameraman. They also shadow 2 firemen and are called in for an emergency. The building has 2 cops present that suffer identical fates here. And there's the same hysterical woman with the same daughter, same husband, and same dog. The rest was scrambled a little, but there are still many analogies. This guy feels like a mashup of Bernard and Yuri. These guys feel like Yuri and Wanda, but have no further function here. Yuri's function was divided over 2 different characters. This Colombian chick is a mashup of Elise and unnamed cleaning lady, as she is the missing resident, but suffers the same fate as the cleaning lady. Elise's epic death is not featured in this movie. Other than that, this dude's not a vet but a medical assistant, the immigrants are Asian and not African, she is 7 instead of 5, Randy and Sadie don't exist here, and the infected at the end is a woman here instead of a man. Story-wise, the only big difference is found at the end. Unlike Quarantine, where the virus outbreak was blamed on a cult stealing a bioweapon, Rec has made a demonic possession the culprit. The outbreak was caused by a mutated enzyme that the penthouse owner was tasked to isolate, but once mutated it became contagious. The person brought in is a Portuguese girl who is also the final infected that Angela faces. Some of the scenes were altered in Quarantine, with varying success. In this scene, for example, the infected is clearly seen biting the medical resident. In Quarantine, the bite isn't as clearly visible, which made the scene afterwards a lot more dramatic and powerful, as the audience does not know whether or not he was condemning a helpful assistant out of fear or knowingly locked in a liar. In Quarantine, the CDC guy also has a partner he is forced to leave behind, also adding to the dramatic effect here, which lacks in Rec. On the other hand, in Rec, the hazmat guy that has been bitten locks himself in to prevent spreading the virus beyond his will, similarly creating a dramatic moral dilemma that lacked in Quarantine in this scene. Some scenes feel hastily and sloppily copied though. This scene, for instance, had the firemen saying they did not know their father was upstairs, as a response to the hazmat guy mentioning the policeman's orders. In Quarantine, the orders weren't mentioned, and the remark from Jake that he did not know felt off as he was just informed that someone was still upstairs. But the worst of the sloppy copying was at the end during the big finale reveal. In Rec, it is much more believable Angela goes through the information, actively trying to read and puzzle everything together, as opposed to Quarantine where she just glances over some headlines. The same goes for the info found afterwards. Instead of just tossing aside all that was sat atop the recorder, she checks it here and links it as folders from the same case. The tape recorder, while portrayed incorrectly, as they rewind where they should have fast-forwarded, was a huge addition to the plot in my eyes. I don't know why they decided to cut that bit in Quarantine. I think it may be because the story presented in Rec is much more interesting than the spin that Quarantine gave it. This gave Rec a huge lead plot and writing-wise, even when it seems like such a minor detail. This is probably also why Rec was open for a sequel, or 3 to be exact, unlike Quarantine. Quarantine does have a part 2, but it's not a sequel. Another thing I feel Rec did better than Quarantine was the attempt at character development by showing interviews for all the residents instead of just a kid. This gave some characters a little more personality. The characters were not stellar in both movies, and it kind of bothered me that most residents were nameless for the majority of the movie, but I feel like Rec put more thought into it. I also think the pacing in Rec was slightly better than Quarantine, mostly on account of spending less time in that fire station. It resulted in Rec being shorter, but I think in this case that's a good thing. Quarantine felt more visually spectacular, and it had good scenes added that weren't in the original, like Elise's death and Bernard's escape attempt. Whereas both cameramen felt like they were really bad at working a camera, I feel like Scott was the least bad out of the two, giving Quarantine another tiny plus. Aside from all that, many of my complaints about consistency, realism, and credibility go for both movies, as they are primarily scenes copied from the original. This puts a very sizable dent in my perception of the quality of both movies. So that was Quarantine, which was decent, but incredibly flawed. Since I've also evaluated Rec in this review, I will rate both movies here. The story was pretty good, it was fairly well paced, and relatively original in its genre. Though I suppose the credit for that goes to Balaguero and Plaza from Rec. Despite being very similar story-wise, I'm rating the original a little higher in this aspect, as the ending was altered and I feel like Rec's original ending was more satisfying. In addition, Quarantine's introduction scene went on for too long, which made Rec's pace better in comparison. The characters were a bit trickier to rate. At first impression, I found them rather weak because many of them weren't really defined much further than resident of apartment A or B, with an occasional job added to their description. However, after evaluating, I actually think it's fitting for the story, as from the audience's point of view, they're supposed to be random residents. Still, in a movie like this, it helps to have some character development, or some interaction that gets you attached to them so that you care about their fate. In both movies, many characters were rarely named, and some weren't named at all, and it's a lot harder to care about man in suit or old woman without a name or some form of backstory. Here too, I'm giving Rec a slightly higher rating as I felt like they made a better attempt at creating such a connection. The camera work, in this case the style of the movie, was actually pretty interesting. Granted, it felt a little cheap and it made the movie a little harder to watch in a conventional horror, but it did add an overall sense of realism, despite inducing a few questionable decisions to uphold the theme. The same goes for the absence of music. It feels a bit weird not to have a score, but it made actual sounds more crucial for the experience. Rating them equal in this regard as I think Quarantine had slightly better shaky cam, but they added a few incorrect sound effects that hurt their style, so I feel that balanced each other out. My biggest issue with this movie was the execution of the story. There were too many inconsistencies, scenes or situations that made no sense, and even ones that were straight up factually incorrect. There were also several situations where the characters would make exceedingly dumb decisions, or where they repeatedly would make the same mistake. Aside from severely damaging the credibility, it also made the whole thing pretty predictable. Quarantine messed up slightly more often, and especially the sloppy editing of the final sequence made me a little more relentless for them than for Rec. The acting was tricky again. Billy was okay, be it slightly over hysterical and whiny at times. In Quarantine in particular, she felt very self-centered though, which felt a bit weird. The firemen and policemen were fine too. Especially Jake and Danny were performed well in my eyes. Their performances outshined their Rec counterparts Manu and Sergio, which both felt a little more static. The residents felt very different between the two movies. I feel like Quarantine used more experienced actors, which made their performances stand out a little when compared to Rec's residents. However, the reactions of the residents in Rec felt more natural, which had a charm on its own. I should note that I watched an English dub of Rec, which means that this evaluation may not be fully representative for the original acting work. The horror aspect of this movie was what made it worth watching, and what redeemed the aforementioned predictability. The gore was well done, with the exception of one gratuitous scene in Quarantine. Despite this, I think they did a slightly better job than Rec in this regard. As said before, the pace was good with the exception of the first scene, which meant that the tension building was good after the first 15 minutes, which made the movie as a whole exciting and entertaining to watch, even though some of the excitement was lost for me as I could see many actions coming from miles away. Overall, I'm kinda torn. This would have been a positive review if it wasn't so damn predictable. I've decided to give it a sufficient rating because it served its purpose as a horror movie well enough. I'm rating Rec slightly higher, primarily because its plot ending was more satisfactory.
No, I know what I'm doing. No, I know, right?
All in all, Quarantine was what one can expect from a Hollywood remake. It was kind of a dumbed down but more spectacular version of its original. If you're not going to poke holes in the story and enjoy the average zombie-themed movie, then you should give this one a try. If you attach a lot of value to sensible decision making, maybe skip this one.